Hello, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is a series of episodes in which we're going to look at the Bible and the genealogies in Scripture. In this episode, I'm going to introduce the topic. I think it's fair to say that everyone is fascinated with genealogies, in particular, our own family genealogy. Here, for example, is the genealogy of the British royal family. And typical of modern genealogies, we have the date when an individual is born and also the date of when someone married. And here is the main question I'd like you to think about as we go through this series on genealogies. Did the ancient biblical writers construct genealogies in the same way that we do today? For example, as we saw in the previous slide, we have the precise dates of when someone is born, and also the date of when they got married and all the children that result from the marriage. So, did the ancients, the biblical writers in particular, construct genealogies in the very same way that we do today? To further explore this very critical question on whether or not the ancient biblical writers constructed genealogies the way we do today, let's look at one of the questions I give on the first day of class in the student's survey to my science religion course. And in question 13, it states, the first two verses of the Bible state, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." And I ask my students, draw a picture of the scene in verse 2 as you envision it. I'd like you to draw an earth and then also the waters. Of course, I sometimes get questions like this. Why? Well, it's to make a very important point with regards to how we read the Scriptures. Over the years, I've made a collection of the different diagrams students have drawn. And I would say about 80 to 85% of the students draw something like this. And I think you see a pattern there. When they saw the word earth, they immediately thought of a spherical earth surrounded by water. But here's the question. Did ancient peoples believe that the earth was spherical? Or, I think you know this, did they believe that the earth was flat? And so very early in my course, I introduced my students to the ancient understanding of the structure of the universe for the biblical peoples, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians. At first, this is a little bit of a shock to students, but all I have to do is think about it for a while. The ancients believed there was a sea of water overhead. Why would they have thought that? Well, the sky is blue. Rain falls from above. Not such a bad idea. And obviously, to keep that water up there, you need some sort of firm structure called the firmament. And you actually see this being described and created on the second day of creation in the first chapter of the Bible. And God separated the waters above from waters below by a firmament. And on the fourth day of creation, God places the sun, moon, and stars in the firmament. Isn't that what it looks like from the perspective of the naked eye? And that's exactly what these ancient peoples believed. Let me now introduce you to a couple very important terms regarding biblical interpretation. Eisegesis comes from the Greek word eis, meaning in or into, and ageomai, meaning to guide. Eisegesis is the reading of our ideas, our modern 21st century ideas, into the Bible. So for those students, when they read the word earth in the Bible and conceive a spherical earth, what have they done? They've forced their modern idea of what the earth is like into the Scriptures, when in fact in the Scriptures we have an ancient three-tier universe with a flat earth. In contrast to eisegesis, exegesis, made up of the Greek term ek, meaning out or out of, and ageomai, to guide, exegesis involves reading the ideas out of the Bible Instead of us forcing our modern 21st century ideas into an ancient text, we're going to let the scriptures, so to speak, do the talking, do the teaching, and inform us with regards to what the biblical writers believed. So I think everyone can agree we should let the scriptures speak to us rather than us force our expectations and our ideas into the Bible. Now that we have some basic terms with regards to biblical interpretation, exegesis and eisegesis, let's turn to one of the first genealogies in the Bible, found in Genesis 5. It's a genealogy of the early Hebrew patriarchs. Now, of course, if you're like me, and I'm going to confess this, you come to a genealogy and what usually happens? We read a couple verses and all of a sudden things get blurry and we jump to the next chapter. And we don't really think hard about what's going on in these genealogies. Other than maybe for Genesis 5, the ages of people are fairly old. Average age is 912 years. But let me ask you, have you ever looked hard at those numbers that you find in this genealogy in Genesis 5? And I have them listed here for you. You'll notice there is a very symmetrical 10 individuals. The other thing you'll notice is, and these are the numbers in bold, that of the 20 numbers listed, 15 are multiples of 5. That is, they end in either a 0 or a 5. Now, if this was just a random set of numbers in a real genealogy, we wouldn't expect more than around 4 or 5, not 15. And in particular, look at the numbers that aren't multiples of 5. There are, interestingly, repeating the number, there are 5 of them. And if you subtract the number 7, and I think most people who know the scriptures know very well the number 7 is a very special number. If we subtract 7 from these 5 numbers, what do we end up with? Can you see it? All multiples of 5. So here's the question. What do you make of these features? Is your genealogy for your family, does it unfold with all these multiples of 5 and with asymmetrical numbers, subtracting 7, giving again 5? What's going on here? Well, we're going to deal with this question as we go through this series of episodes on genealogies in the Bible. Of course, when we talk about genealogies, we can't help but talk about Adam. And I want to point out very early here in the introduction that I have an agenda. One of the arguments Christians often give who believe there really was a historical Adam is they argue that Adam is in the genealogies. And since Adam is in the genealogies, Adam must indeed be a real person. And indeed, Adam appears in biblical genealogies. In the first time, it's in Genesis 5, and Adam is the very first person. This is the very same thing in 1 Chronicles chapter 1. And in Luke 3, this is the genealogy of Jesus, which is set up in reverse, coming to the very first person. So clearly, Adam appears in the biblical genealogies as the very first person. And so here's your question, and we're going to deal with this as we go through this series of episodes. Is this evidence, is this proof that because Adam is in these genealogies, therefore Adam must be a real person? Again, I've got an agenda here. I want you to be aware of it. And as we go through these series and eventually we'll come towards the end, I'll come to some sort of answer with regards to my views on Adam. This is the end of the episode. Hi there, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is a series of episodes exploring the Bible and genealogies. In this episode, we're going to look at the 2 genealogies of Jesus, one in Matthew 1 and the other in Luke 3. There is a one-page handout for this episode, and it's easy to find. It's on my webpage under Web Lectures, and there is the URL. Let's examine these two genealogies of Jesus in Matthew 1 and Luke 3 and identify some basic features. In both we have the patriarch Abraham. But in the Luke genealogy, we have a series of people that are before Abraham. So when it comes to the Matthew genealogy, it is a shorter genealogy. In both genealogies, we refer to Jesus. Now notice what we have in Matthew 1. We have a total of 14 plus 14 is 28, plus another 14 is 42 individuals, while in Luke, there's a total of 56 between Jesus and Abraham. It's a bit of an asymmetry there. Another thing to note is that when it comes to the people between Abraham and Jesus, and that's where you see all the check marks, they don't all align perfectly. There's a lot of people that are missing between the two genealogies. And of course the question, what are we to do with this? Let's now look more carefully at the genealogy of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew. The first verse begins, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, notice what we have after that is a list of 42 individuals. And notice they are 3 clumps of 14. And we continue in verse 17, thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to Christ. Now there's a repetition of the number 14. It's very, very symmetrical. Is this the way modern genealogies function, or could it be in the ancient world they constructed genealogies in a way that is different from us? In order to understand why the number 14 is being repeated in Matthew 1 in the genealogy of Jesus, is that we need to know a little bit about the Hebrew alphabet, and in particular, their stylistic use of their letters. Hebrew is made up of only consonants. When it comes to the vowels, these were simply understood. In particular, in Hebrew, they had a technique called gematria, whereby they gave a numerical value to each letter of their alphabet. So, for example, the first letter, alphabet, has the value 1. The next letter, bet, has the number 2. And when it comes to the Matthew 1 genealogy of Jesus, I want us to focus on the Daleth, which is the 4th letter and has a numerical value of 4, and the Vav, which has a numerical value of 6. Now that we have an appreciation of the Hebrew alphabet and their stylistic technique of giving every letter a value, notice what we have here for the gematria of David, as in King David. So the Daleth, the Vav, and the Daleth, add them all up and you get 14. This is the stylistic number of David. And we have to remember that every biblical author has an audience and an agenda. And for Matthew, he's writing to Jewish individuals to emphasize that Jesus is the son of David. And this is stated in Matthew 9 times, while it appears only 3 times in Mark and twice in Luke. So the whole idea of having these 14s repeated over and over again, and that audience would have understood it, is to focus that Jesus is the son of David. Now, of course, we today would never use such a technique, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do. It matters what the ancient inspired authors did, and we have to respect their stylistic techniques. So let's continue examining the genealogy of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew. Alongside these clumps of 14, 14, and 14, I've placed the genealogies from the book of 1 Chronicles. Now you'll notice in the first 14, it aligns perfectly. But notice what happens in the second 14. In the book of Chronicles, there are 4 individuals that Matthew has eliminated. Now, why would he delete these names? Well, I think he has that agenda, wanting to get across this series of 14, 14, and 14 to emphasize that Jesus is the son of David, and 14 is the gematria, the special number, the stylistic number for Matthew. And then finally, the last clump of 14, we see that there's only one in alignment. So what's happening here? And of course, none of us do this today in our own genealogies. But the biblical authors had the liberty to do this. This was their technique. Of course, we'd never do that, but it doesn't matter. We have to respect their techniques. And as a consequence, when we read these genealogies, we should be looking for messages of faith that are embedded in the genealogies rather than reading them the way we do today as our modern genealogies. Let's now look at the second genealogy of Jesus, which appears in Luke 3. And again, for years, when I'd come to this genealogy, I'd read the first 3-4 people, and then I'd jump over to the next chapter. That was a mistake, because when it comes to biblical genealogies, they have messages of faith. In particular, I've put numbers on all these individuals. Look at the total. It's a total of 77. And most Christians are aware that the number 7 is a very special number. It's the perfect number. It's the number of fulfillment. And so what we're seeing here is 77 is the perfect number. Jesus is the perfect individual. Jesus is the perfect fulfillment of God's plan. And this is what Luke is trying to get across in this genealogy. Just a couple comments before I come to some conclusions. It's worth pointing out that some Christians, when they first discover that the two genealogies of Jesus do not align, they attempt to argue that one genealogy is through Mary, that is, Jesus' mother. It's through her line, the maternal line, and the other one is through Joseph, or in other words, the paternal line. But notice what we have in both genealogies. We have Joseph next to Jesus. So clearly, these are paternalistic lines. Also, it's worth noting is that in the ancient world, in particular among the Hebrews, these were patriarchal societies, not matriarchal societies. So the argument that one is the genealogy of Mary, I don't think works. So what are we to do with the fact that the two genealogies of Jesus do not align up perfectly? For me, this isn't a problem at all, because I appreciate that ancient writers, when they were doing genealogies and constructing them, had this amazing freedom, and their central purpose was to get across spiritual truths, and that they could manipulate these genealogies in whichever way they saw fit. When it came to Matthew, Matthew repeated groups of 14 to get across the gematria, the special number of David, to say that Jesus is the son of David. When it comes to Luke, the number of individuals in his genealogy was 77, the perfect number, to get across the message that Jesus is the perfect fulfillment. Let me now draw some conclusions of our examination of the two genealogies of Jesus. What we've seen in these two genealogies is the use of stylistic numbers. We don't do that in our genealogies today, but in the ancient world they did, and we need to respect that. Second, these genealogies have a central purpose, and that's to deliver a message of faith, or in other words, a deep inerrant spiritual truth. For Matthew, it's to get across the message that Jesus is the son of David, as prophesied in the Old Testament. And for Luke, it's to underline that Jesus is the perfect fulfillment. And finally, we need to always remember this when we read an ancient text. When it comes to the genealogies of Jesus, do not read through our modern concept of genealogy. We never use stylistic numbers. We're also very keen on making sure we never miss an individual in a genealogy. But in the ancient world, they could do that for the purpose of getting a message of faith across. This is the end of the episode. Hi, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is a series of episodes in which we're examining the Bible and its different genealogies. In order to understand Scripture, it is always good to examine the literature of different nations around the Hebrews. And there's some very valuable insights with regards to genealogies in examining what are known as the Sumerian king lists. There is a one-page handout for this episode, and it's easy to find. It's on my web page under Web Lectures, and there is the URL. Now, before we examine the Sumerian king lists, I just want you to be mindful of two genealogies that appear very early in the Bible. Genesis 5 is a genealogy of the Hebrew patriarchs, and this is a key word, before the flood, that is Noah's flood. And you'll notice in this genealogy that people live very, very long, an average age of 912 years. And the other thing you'll notice when it comes to the bold numbering, they're all multiples of 5. In other words, 15 of these 20 numbers are multiples of 5. And in a random scatter, we should have roughly around 4 or 5 at the most. So there seems to be something going on here. The other genealogy I'd like you to be aware of is in Genesis 11. And this is the genealogy of the Hebrew patriarchs after the flood, that is Noah's flood. Once again, we see a nice symmetrical 10 individuals. We also have, again, the multiples of 5 appearing in terms of the numbers, where we have 12 of the 20 either ending in 0 or 5. And of course, we can't help but ask the question, what does this mean? Is this indicative of something? Just a little bit more background before we examine the Sumerian king lists. Ancient Sumer was one of the very first civilizations on Earth, and it reigned roughly between 3100 and 2400 BC. Sumer was found at the southern end of what is modern-day Iraq near the Persian Gulf. And a thing to note, that we have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers traveling through this region. And in particular, these rivers flooded a lot, so we shouldn't be surprised that the ancient Sumerians would make reference to some sort of flooding events. Please turn to your handout and let's look at some of these Sumerian king lists. It's important to note that the Sumerians, just like the Hebrews, believed that there was a destructive worldwide flood. And what you have here are two lists of kings labeled WB444 and WB62. The lists of kings and their reigns in years, and immediately you'll notice that these reigns are exceedingly long, in tens of thousands of years. Let's look more carefully at 444. Firstly, you'll note that you have a total of 8 different kings in this list. The length of reign that is the longest is 43,200 years, and the shortest is 18,600 years. If we take the average of all these reigns, it is 30,150 years. So clearly this is exceedingly, exceedingly long. In the WB62 list of Sumerian kings before the flood, you'll notice that we have 10 kings. Again, we have the length of reigns that are exceedingly long. The longest are 72,000 years, and the shortest are 21,600 years. And if we take an average of all these reigns, we get an average length of reign of 45,560 years. There's another feature we need to note when it comes to these two lists of Sumerian kings, and it's this. The reigns all end in a multiple of 100. Similar to the Bible in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, most of the numbers are multiples of 5. So something must be going on here. This does not strike us as just a regular and random set of reigns. And some people have theorized the following, that what we see here is these numbers can all be reduced into a certain formula, 60 to the power of 2 times x, a certain number. And of course the question arises, what do we make of this number 60? Well, one thing we know about the number 60 is that it is part of the numbering system in the ancient world, in particular the cuneiform numbers, these little wedges we have in early writing. And so the number 60 takes on a special meaning. This is a special number. And so by using these numbers in base 60, this king list is affirming that the kings are very special individuals. Let's now consider a list of kings who reigned after the flood. This comes from WB 444, and you'll notice that we have a steady decrease in the length of reigns, ending up in a region somewhat similar to us today. Another thing to note, that when it comes to the first third, we have the reigns that can be reduced into a 60 times x formula, very symmetrical. Then in the middle third, this formula starts to break down until finally there is no 60 times x formula for the last third of the list. Thing to note, in the first third, average reign is 942 years. Then it reduces to an average reign in the middle third of 630 to down to 29 years. Again, something more in the region of what we would understand to be normal reigns for kings. I'm sure you must be asking the question, what are we to do with these Sumerian king lists both before and after the flood? Well, it's this. The purpose of these king lists was to legitimize these lists of kings. In other words, to legitimize the royal court in ancient Sumer. And in doing so, they brought in stylistic numbers. In particular for them, the stylistic number 60 was a very important one. And by doing this, they're affirming that these are the kings, and in particular that these are kings that God ordained to reign over ancient Sumer. Let's now draw some conclusions with regards to the Sumerian king lists. First, I think it's pretty clear that what we have here is the use of stylistic numbers. These are not literal numbers or literal reigns, but rather they're stylistic, and in particular the use of the number 60, the special number for that culture. As a consequence, the whole idea of these lists is to deliver a message, in particular that the kings are very special, that this is a legitimization of the royal court. And finally, I think it's pretty clear, do not read the lists through our modern concept of reigns. For example, we talk about a king reigning some 30 years, and we mean literally 30 years being king. But when we read these Sumerian king lists, we have to realize that these numbers are stylistic and not literal. In the light of these stylistic features that we're finding in the Sumerian king lists both before and after the flood, I'm sure you must be asking the question, could it be that the inspired writer of these genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, could it be that the inspired writer is using a similar stylistic technique in order to legitimize the Hebrew patriarchs, that is, in order to underline that these are special people and that the Hebrew line is indeed a special line? Well, we're going to investigate this question in our next episode. This is the end of the episode. Hi there, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is a series of episodes where we're looking at the Bible and its genealogies. In this episode, we're going to look at two genealogies of the Hebrew patriarchs that appear in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 11. There is a one-page handout for this episode, and it's easy to find. It's on my web page under Web Lectures, and there is the URL. In Genesis 5, we have a genealogy of the Hebrew patriarchs before the flood of Noah. And there are a number of striking features. Firstly, there is a nice symmetrical 10 individuals in this genealogy. Another thing to note is the ages of these individuals. They're quite high. For example, when it comes to Adam, he's 130 years old when his son is born, and he lives for a period of 800 years after the birth. So Adam lives a total of 930 years. And if we take the average of all these 10 individuals with regards to the length of their lives, it is quite high. It's 912 years, which should catch our attention. Another striking feature in this genealogy in Genesis 5 deals with the bold numbers. If you'll notice, they're all multiples of 5. That is, they either end in 0 or 5. And there's a total of 15 of them. Of course, in a list of 20 numbers, we would expect maybe 3 or 4 or 5 multiples of 5. But having 15 definitely skews it in a certain direction to make us wonder, are these numbers being used, if you wish, stylistically? Another thing to notice is when it comes to those numbers that are not multiples of 5. And interestingly, there's a group of 5 of them. And if we subtract the mystical number 7, which is a well-known mystical number in the ancient world, if we subtract 7 from these 5 asymmetrical numbers, and what do we get? You'll notice a multiple of 5 again. So something is going on in this genealogy that strikes us as this is not a natural genealogy. First, the ages are way too old, and then the number 5 being repeated over and over again has to strike a chord in us to make us wonder what's going on. Maybe something stylistic? One possibility to explain this repetitive use of the number 5 in this genealogy in Genesis 5 is that possibly it's reflecting the fact that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books, which of course is the Torah for the Hebrews. What we call the Penta, which is 5, Tuk, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So by repeating the number 5 over and over again, what is being done is a stylistic use, an emphasis that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books, the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If we turn to Genesis 11, we'll find another genealogy of the Hebrew patriarchs, this time of individuals who lived after the flood of Noah. Like Genesis 5, this genealogy has a nice symmetrical number of 10 individuals. The thing to note with regards to how long they lived, though they live a lot longer than us, there is certainly a reduction in lifespan, similar to that we found in the Sumerian king lists. In this genealogy, people live an average age of 333 years. In contrast, Genesis 5, the individuals lived 912 years. Similar to Genesis 5, you'll notice in this genealogy that there are a lot of multiples of 5. Of the 20 numbers, 12 of these either end in a 0 or a 5. Notably, 2 of these asymmetrical numbers, that is, numbers that don't end in a 5 or a 0, is that if you subtract 7, you'll get a multiple of 5, similar to what we saw in Genesis 5. However, here's the difference with Genesis 11 and 5. Genesis 11 has 6 numbers that don't end in 5 and don't become 5 by subtracting 7. So what we're seeing here is some asymmetry starting to show up in this genealogy after the flood for the Hebrew patriarchs. And of course, this seems to echo the asymmetry that we discovered in the previous episode with the Sumerian kings and their reigns after the Great Flood. One of the most fascinating things about these genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 is that if you put them together and also include Isaac from Genesis 21, you end up with this absolutely magnificent and beautifully symmetrical genealogical framework of the Hebrews. In particular, you'll notice there's a grand total of 25 individuals, which of course is echoing again the number 5, because 25 is 5 times 5. This is reflecting that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books. They're the people of the Torah. You will also notice that the number 5 is being emphasized with 2 very famous individuals in this genealogy, Noah and Abraham. Noah is at position 10, that nice symmetrical number 10. And 10, of course, is 2 times 5. And Abraham, again, at another symmetrical number, a beautiful number of 2 times 10, or also 4 times 5. The mystical number 7 also appears in this genealogical framework. Enoch is the individual who walked with God, and he does not die. He's the individual that is taken away, and he's at position number 7. At position 14, which of course is 7 times 2, we have Eber. And from Eber we get the word Hebrew. And finally, at position 21, which of course is 7 times 3, we have Isaac, the promised son. Abraham and Sarah were too old to have children, but God intervened miraculously and gave them the gift of their boy, Isaac. I'm sure you must be asking the question, what do you do with these genealogies that are so symmetrical, that use such stylistic numbers? Well, the first time you learn of them, it's certainly a bit challenging, because most Christians go to these genealogies, read them very literally in the same sort of way that we would read genealogies today. And so what I'm going to suggest that we have to respect the text. They're using stylistic techniques. And in this way, we're not to take them as genealogies that we have today. Now, before I close this episode, I need to make a very important cautionary note. And it's this. Within the Bible, clearly, as we saw in Genesis 5 and 11, there are stylistic numbers. But this does not mean that every number in the Bible is stylistic. Take, for example, here this list of the reigns in years of the kings of Judah. And as you look at this list, you can certainly appreciate this looks like a list of regular reigns as we would understand it today. So when reading Scripture, you're going to always have to ask the question, is it a stylistic number, or is it indeed a realistic number indicating a literal number of years, as in the case here of the kings of Judah? And be assured, with a little practice, you're going to be able to identify the stylistic numbers from the realistic and literal numbers. In studying these genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, I think we can come to some conclusion. These genealogies use stylistic numbers, in particular, the multiples of 5. And of course, this stylistic number would be a very special one for the Hebrews, because 5 represents the number of books in the Torah. Conclusion number 2, the purpose of genealogies, in particular in the ancient world, is to deliver a message of faith. What's being said, especially by the repeated use of 5, is that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books of the Torah. These are a very special people. In particular, they are the people of the God of the Bible. And finally, here's the take-home message of these 2 genealogies. Do not read them through our modern concept of genealogy. For us, a number in a genealogy is literal and realistic. But in Genesis 5 and 11, these are stylistic to get across that important message of faith, that the Hebrews are special, that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books. So here's the most important thing for people dealing with the origins debate. Don't go to Genesis 5 and 11, adding up these genealogies and trying to attempt to determine the age of the universe. These are not actual numbers. They're not literal numbers. They're stylistic numbers. And as a consequence, seeing there are stylistic numbers in the Bible, we cannot add them up to determine the age of the earth. This is the end of the episode. Hi, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is a series of episodes dealing with the Bible and its genealogies. In this episode, we're going to talk about Adam and the biblical genealogies. If you will recall, from the very first episode, I admitted to you that I had an agenda in doing this series of presentations on genealogies. In particular, the issue of genealogies relates very closely to the issue of whether or not Adam was a real person in history. To further explain my genealogy, it's important to note that Adam appears in 3 different genealogies in the Bible: Genesis 5, 1 Chronicles 1, and Luke 3, the genealogy of Jesus. And most Christians, when they see Adam in these genealogies, argue that Adam must be a real historical person because he's part of a genealogy, in particular, the genealogy of Jesus. So here's the question. The fact that Adam does indeed appear in these genealogies, does it make it true that Adam was a real historical person in the past? In order to answer this question about the historicity of Adam and his relationship to the biblical genealogies, I'm going to answer in 2 parts. In part 1, I'm going to deal with early Israel and the notion of oral tradition, and in part 2, I'm going to deal with ancient science and origins. In order to answer this question about the historicity of Adam and his relationship to the biblical genealogies, I'm going to answer in 2 parts. In part 1, I'm going to deal with early Israel and the notion of oral tradition, and in part 2, I'm going to deal with ancient science and origins. In beginning with early Israel and oral tradition, we need a basic definition of this concept of oral tradition. And it's this: oral traditions appear in communities without writing. In other words, they're pre-literate communities or oral communities. Oral traditions feature the beliefs of the community, in other words, the religious and philosophic beliefs, and also in oral traditions there is an account of the origins of the world. And most importantly for us, oral traditions include genealogies that account for the origin of the community. There are some very significant implications with regards to oral traditions, and all you have to do is think about this for a second. Oral traditions, by and large, will be short, and this is simply because of the limits of human memory. So you're not going to have an oral tradition that goes on for 7 or 8 hours, but rather oral traditions are very, very short. Most people can remember them. Now, there's a significant implication with regards to genealogies in these oral traditions, and it'll be this: these will be short. In other words, the limits of memory will not allow most people to remember, say, 250,000 different people in a genealogy. And as a consequence, what you find in genealogies may be a dozen, at the most 24 or so people. In the light of oral tradition, let's now situate early Israel in history. And here are some rough dates. Abraham lived around 2000 BC. Alphabetic writing, that is, writing like ours using an alphabet, appears about 1700 BC, and Moses lived around 1250 BC. Given these three dates, it becomes clear that Abraham must have lived within an oral culture. In other words, Abraham was a pre-literate and did not have writing. Evidence that the early Hebrews did not have writing, and that is, that they were an oral community, is subtly present in the first book of the Bible. There are no references to the Hebrews writing any sort of document in the book of Genesis. In addition, the agreement that God makes with Abraham, that is, the Abrahamic covenant, in it, God does not command Abraham to write down the covenant. Instead, God commands Abraham to circumcise all the males, and circumcision becomes the sign of the covenant between God and Israel. In contrast to the Abrahamic covenant, in the Mosaic covenant, God commands Moses to write down the covenant. As Exodus 34:28 states, Moses wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. It is only in the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, that we see the first references in Scripture to the Hebrews' writing. In the light of this biblical evidence, we can ask a very important question. Did the early Hebrews have an oral tradition before they started to write down their religious beliefs, an account of origins, and genealogies of the origin of their community? And the answer to this question is a definite yes. For the Hebrews to function as a community, they must have had an oral tradition to cement the community together. In particular, to explain the origin of their community, the Hebrews undoubtedly had genealogies. And since they were an oral community, their genealogies would have been quite short because of the limits of human memory. If we return to the earliest genealogies of the Hebrews in the book of Genesis, we see that there is a total of only 25 individuals. This would be consistent with the idea that early Israel was an oral community and had an oral tradition with short genealogies of the community. Of course, Israel eventually became literate and then wrote down these oral traditions and their genealogies to become the sources behind the early chapters of the book of Genesis. In part one of trying to understand the question of the relationship between Adam and the biblical genealogies, we came to recognize that early Israel undoubtedly had an oral tradition with short genealogies. Let's now look at part two. Part two deals with the idea that the Bible has an ancient understanding of nature, or to put it another way, Scripture has an ancient science. Now, this is a very large topic, and you might want to listen to my series of episodes on the Bible and ancient science. But for our purposes in this present episode, I will briefly touch this topic and suggest that the Bible has an ancient science, and in particular, an ancient understanding of origins. One of the best places to see the ancient science in the Bible is to consider the structure of the universe. We don't have to go very far into the Bible before we start seeing this. In the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, we find on the second day of creation that God creates a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. Of course, the idea of a body of water above the earth does not make much sense to 21st century readers of Scripture like us. But for ancient people, the belief in a heavenly sea overhead was perfectly reasonable because, after all, the sky is blue and rain falls from above. For ancient people, it was only logical that a solid structure was holding up the heavenly sea. And in the Bible, this structure is called the firmament. Ancient science also appears on the fourth day of creation in Genesis 1. On this day, God sets the sun, the moon, and the stars in the firmament. And isn't that what it looks like from the perspective of the naked eye? I'm sure you will agree that this ancient understanding of the structure of the world makes perfect sense, given the fact that ancient people did not have scientific instruments like telescopes. You will have noticed that ancient people in the Middle East believed that the earth was surrounded by a circumferential sea. Now, why would they have thought that? Well, just think of the regional geography. Ancient peoples would have traveled in all directions and eventually come to a body of water. So to think that they were surrounded by a body of water and that the earth was like an island made perfect sense from their ancient perspective. So clearly, in the Bible, we have an ancient understanding of astronomy. We also have an ancient understanding of geography and geology. Therefore, it is only consistent to suggest that ancient people also had an ancient biology. For most of us today, it's easy to understand the ancient astronomy and the ancient geography and geology, but grasping ancient biology is a little more challenging. So let's try to think about living organisms through an ancient mindset. In order to understand the concept of ancient biology, let me begin with a question. What did the ancients see when looking at living organisms? Take, for example, goats. The ancients would have seen that a goat gives birth to a goat, which gives birth to a goat. In other words, goats only give birth to goats. Consequently, for ancient peoples, living organisms are immutable. That is, they are unchanging. The idea that living organisms evolved would not have been part of the experience of ancient peoples. Biological evolution would not have made much sense to them, in the same way that the idea of a spherical Earth would not have made much sense either. This notion that living organisms are immutable and unchanging is clearly reflected in the Bible. We see in the first chapter of Scripture that the reproduction of life is according to their kinds, and this phrase appears 10 times in Genesis 1. Clearly what we have here is an ancient biology, in particular an ancient taxonomy. Here's another question. What are the implications of ancient taxonomy, that is, the immutability of living organisms? What are the implications of ancient taxonomy for the creation of life? Well, very reasonably, ancient peoples would have taken their experience, for example, of goats giving birth to goats, and they would have reversed this data set back into time. In other words, they would have known that a goat came from a goat, etc., 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 and they would have logically come to the conclusion that all these goats must have come from an original set of goats which God would have created. This ancient notion of origins is known as de novo creation. It is the quick and complete creation of the world and living organisms. Of course, the idea that living organisms are created quickly and fully mature ultimately reflects an ancient taxonomy. And as we've seen, this phrase is repeated 10 times in Genesis 1, with living organisms reproducing according to their kinds. It is worth identifying this logical process that the ancients used in understanding the origin of life. This is called retrojection. It involves taking present evidence and casting it back in time to explain the past. To use the example of goats, the ancients took their experience of goats giving birth to goats, and they reversed this experience back into time to explain the origin of goats. It's worth pointing out that retrojection is the type of thinking used today in crime scene investigations. Police officers at the crime scene use present evidence to reconstruct the past and the events of the crime. Let's now get closer to our topic of genealogies in the Bible. Question: what did the ancients see when looking at human beings? They would have seen that a human gives birth to a human who gives birth to a human. Consequently, the ancients would have believed that humans are immutable and unchanging. The idea that humans evolve would not have made much sense to ancient peoples like the biblical authors. I suspect most of you have an idea of where I'm going with this line of questioning. Let me ask you another question. What are the implications of the immutability of humans for the creation of life? And I think you know the answer. The ancient Hebrews would have taken their experience of humans giving birth to humans, etc., and then they would have retrojected this experience back in time. For example, a human came from a human who came from a human who ultimately came from the original human who for the ancient Hebrews was Adam. And this is exactly what we find in the second chapter of the Bible, Genesis 2, the de novo creation of the first man. God creates Adam quickly and fully developed. But most importantly, we must remember that de novo creation is an ancient understanding of origins. And similar to the ancient understanding of the structure of the universe, it does not align with physical reality and the facts of science today. The de novo creation of Adam is an ancient conceptualization of human origins. Here is the key to understanding the relationship between Adam and the biblical genealogies in which he appears. We need to think like ancient peoples and connect the two main parts of this episode. More specifically, we need to connect the idea that early Israel was an oral community with an oral tradition that included short genealogies, and this needs to be connected to the concept that the biblical peoples had an ancient science regarding the origin of life, in particular, the origin of human life. Let's try to think like the early Hebrews and connect these two parts. First, they would have seen before their eyes humans giving birth to humans, etc. In attempting to understand the origin of humans, the early Hebrews would have very logically retrojected this data set back into time. Now, undoubtedly, they would have remembered some important individuals in the history of their peoples. However, the limits of human memory would have limited how many of these individuals would have been remembered. Therefore, early Israel would have in its oral traditions short genealogies of real people. Second, the early Hebrews were typical of any ancient peoples, and they accepted ancient science and ancient origins. In order to understand human origins, they accepted the ancient concept of the de novo creation of the first man, which for them was Adam. Here in my mind is the key to understanding Adam in the biblical genealogies. The early Hebrews had short genealogies of real people in their oral traditions. The early Hebrews also accepted the ancient concept of the de novo creation of the first man, which for them was Adam. Very logically, the early Hebrews connected Adam to the short genealogies of real people. Stated another way, they retrojected their experience of humans giving birth to humans back to the original man. Had we lived at that time, we would have believed the very same thing and made the very same connection between the concept of the de novo creation of Adam and the earliest genealogy remembered by the Hebrews from their oral tradition. To be sure, the idea that Adam ultimately reflects an ancient understanding of origins is indeed very challenging to most Christians. To further explore this possibility, let me suggest that you consider listening to my series of episodes entitled, Was Adam a Real Person? Once you've listened to these lectures, then return to this episode on the relationship between Adam and the biblical genealogies, and I'm quite certain you will find this episode not as challenging. Let's now draw some conclusions from our study of Adam in the biblical genealogies. The first man in Scripture, Adam, is based on an ancient science of human origins, de novo creation. That is, creation which is quick and complete. Consequently, biblical genealogies include ancient concepts which we today would not accept as aligning with physical reality. The short oral genealogies of the early Hebrews were connected to Adam, whom the Hebrews conceived or conceptualized to be the first man ever created. And this is the key to understanding Adam and the biblical genealogies. More specifically, short genealogies, which included real people from the early Hebrews, were connected to an ancient biology of human origins. And like the ancient astronomy and ancient geography in the Bible, this ancient biology does not align with physical reality. It is always important to remember that the main purpose of ancient genealogies is to deliver a message of faith, that is, a spiritual truth. In the case of the early genealogies of the Hebrews in the Bible, found in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, the central message is to reveal that the Hebrews are God's special people. Finally, and I'm certain you now understand this, it is important that we today do not read ancient genealogies like those in the Bible through our modern concept of a genealogy. If we do this, we would be doing eisegesis, the forcing of modern ideas into an ancient text. Instead, we should be doing exegesis. We need to respect the ancient text and allow it to teach us how ancient writers, like the biblical writers, constructed their genealogies. This is the end of the episode. Hi there, this is Dennis Lamoureux, and this is the concluding episode in my series on the Bible and genealogies. In the introductory episode to this series, I asked the question, did the ancient biblical writers construct genealogies in the same way that we do today? After going through this series, I suspect you've come to the same answer I have. And the answer is a very definite no. For us, a genealogy is simply a list of names with accurate dates of when individuals are born, when they get married, and when they die. In contrast, ancient genealogies like those of the Bible are constructed primarily to deliver a spiritual truth. And in doing so, they often use stylistic techniques, including the use of symbolic numbers. Here are the three main conclusions for this series of episodes. First, biblical genealogies use stylistic numbers. Therefore, we simply cannot add up these numbers to determine the age of the earth. These numbers are symbolic and they carry a specific meaning for an ancient audience, like the biblical writers and their readers. Second, the biblical genealogies deliver a message of faith. That is their central purpose. And finally, it's important that 21st century readers do not read the ancient genealogies in Scripture through our modern concept of a genealogy. In light of these three conclusions, let's now review some of the genealogies we examine in this series of lectures to see if indeed these conclusions are correct. In our study of the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, we noted that the author was focusing on the number 14. In fact, this genealogy is made up of 3 groups of 14, and I'm certain that most of you will agree that actual and natural genealogies do not unfold in this way. For example, I'm certain that your own family genealogy does not unfold in groups of 14 like that of Jesus in Matthew 1. As we noted in a previous episode, the reason Matthew features the number 14 is because it is the gematria of David, that is, it is the symbolic number of King David. The reason Matthew focuses on 14 and David is that he wants to emphasize to his Jewish audience that Jesus is indeed the son of David. And Jewish readers of this gospel would have known that and would have been aware of this stylistic technique. We also noticed in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus that in the middle group of 14 individuals, there were 4 individuals that were deleted from an earlier genealogy, which we find in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Of course, no one today would ever imagine of doing that in constructing a genealogy. But in the ancient world, that was perfectly acceptable. Because again, ancient genealogies were fashioned and even manipulated to get across a central message. In this way, by deleting 4 individuals that appear in 1 Chronicles 3, Matthew was able to emphasize the symbolic number 14. In a similar way, the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke also uses a well-known symbolic number. 7 in the ancient world was the number for fulfillment and completion. By listing 77 individuals in his genealogy of Jesus, Luke was able to underline that Jesus was the perfect fulfillment. When we compare the 2 genealogies of Jesus in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, we noted that these genealogies do not match up perfectly. Of course, if we read these genealogies through our modern 21st century concept of a genealogy, then we would certainly have a problem. But if we respect the ancient techniques in constructing genealogies, then there are no difficulties whatsoever. In other words, we must not force our expectations and our standards for genealogies into the biblical genealogies. Let's now turn to the first 2 genealogies of the Hebrews in the opening chapters of the Bible. Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are fascinating genealogies. In particular, the numbers in these genealogies feature multiples of 5, as seen with the bowl numbers. I suspect the best explanation for this repeated use of the number 5 is to emphasize the fact that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books. In other words, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. As we saw earlier, when we combine the genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, along with Genesis 21, we discover this absolutely magnificent geological framework with 25 individuals. And once again, we see the emphasis on the stylistic number 5, with the number 25 being the multiplication of 5 times 5. I suspect everyone will agree that real genealogies do not unfold in such a symmetrical way. Again, I think the message of faith in these genealogies is to emphasize that the Hebrews are the people of the 5 books, the Pentateuch. A very important implication of the fact that the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 feature stylistic numbers is that these are not actual and literal periods of time. Consequently, Christians today must not add up these periods of time in these genealogies in order to determine the age of the earth and the universe. We need to respect the stylistic technique of the biblical writer and not force our modern expectations and assumptions into his genealogies. Returning once more to the introductory lecture in this series of episodes, I admitted to you that I had an agenda for doing this study of the biblical genealogies. My agenda was to discover the relationship between the biblical genealogies and Adam, Many Christians today believe that since Adam appears in 3 genealogies in the Bible, they contend that Adam must be a real and actual person who lived in history. In order to understand the relationship between Adam and the biblical genealogies, we need to appreciate 2 important components. First, the early Hebrews were an oral society. In their oral traditions, they had genealogies of real people who lived in their community. But because of the limits of human memory, only a handful of individuals were remembered. Second, the early Hebrews, like all ancient peoples, believed the ancient scientific concept of the de novo creation of the first man. To say that humans evolved would not have made sense to them. This was simply not part of their experience. Here is the key to understanding Adam in the biblical genealogies. The early Hebrews connected their short genealogies of real people to the common concept that the first person was created de novo by God, that is, created quickly and fully formed. This connection of the genealogies to the first man was perfectly reasonable. Had we lived at that time, this is exactly what we would have believed. Of course, there is a very significant implication with regards to this approach. It indicates that the creation of the first man is an ancient understanding of human origins. In other words, Adam's very existence is based on ancient science, and like all ancient science, it does not align with physical reality. Therefore, in order to understand how God actually created humanity, we need to open the book of God's works, that is, the book of nature, and we need to do the science. This is the end of the episode, and this is the very last episode in my series entitled The Bible and Genealogies. I hope you found some of the information to be valuable. This has been Dennis Lamoureux. Thanks for listening.